This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, co-founder, and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, Jamie Bogner. We are in St. Louis this week, hanging out with some brewers and drinking some beers for the Side Project Invitational Beer Festival. And for this episode of the podcast with Brad Clark of Private Press Brewing, former director of brewing operations for Jackie O's, we are stashed between fooders in the Side Project Brew House.
We're in the forest.
Welcome to the podcast, Brad.
Thank you, Jamie. Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So Brad's he's made a unique career leap coming out of a larger kind of production brewing operation at Jackie O's, and is in the process of launching Private Press, a kind of bespoke membership-only brewing program out of California.
Correct.
Now. And from what I understand, those memberships start selling in early summer, and you'll have beer out this fall. We're going to talk to Brad about brewing barrel-aged beers. This Private Press project is solely devoted to barley wines and stouts aged in wood.
Correct.
So it's a pretty unique business proposition, and we'll use everything that Brad has learned from making those barrel-aged beers in his past occupation at Jackie O's. Before we get started, nearly 2,000 breweries across the U.S., Canada, and Mexico partner with G&D Chillers. Innovative modular designs and no proprietary parts propel G&D ahead as the premier choice for your glycol chilling needs. Breweries you recognize like Russian River, Ninkasi, Jack's Abbey, Sam Adams, and more trust G&D to chill the beer you love. Call G&D Chillers to discuss your project today or reach out directly at gdchillers.com. Also, kickstart your innovation with Old Orchard Craft Juice Concentrates. Old Orchard knows that a strategic seasonal release calendar means higher margins, increased taproom traffic, and secured shelf space for your brand. That's why they collaborate with countless breweries on product development conversations year-round. With unique flavors like watermelon, rhubarb, pineapple, and plum, the possibilities are endless. Get your Old Orchard sample kit with a free 6-pack cooler at www.oldorchard.com/brewer. Before we start the conversation, please go to beerandbrewing.com, click on that subscribe button, and become a subscriber to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. And if you really love to brew, consider the all-access subscription tier, which will give you access to all of our video classes on brewing, one of which is relatively new, was filmed right here at Side Project with Corey King, who spends almost 90 minutes talking about how he brews barrel-aged beers. So check that out, beerandbrewing.com, all access. Brad Clark.
Yes.
Let's talk about you for a minute.
Sounds great.
Or for the rest of the minutes of this podcast, for that matter. Talk to me in the way that we normally do. We normally start off with, talking about your history in brewing. So walk me through it, and relatively quickly, how you became a brewer, how you worked through Jackie O's, and then what led you to make this leap onto your own with Private Press.
All right. So, I got really interested in beer while I was in college. I was going to Ohio University in Athens, Ohio. Around 2002, I had discovered that there was a small brew pub in Athens named O'Hooley's. When I was 19, I started going to O'Hooley's. I fell in love with their pale ale, which is called Ohio Pale Ale. And I started going there quite often, and got a fake ID, became a regular, turned 21, and I got a job there in June of 2004 as a door guy and a happy hour bartender. The gentleman that was brewing at O'Hooley's at the time had just opened up the Athens Do-It-Yourself shop, which is a homebrew shop in Athens, Ohio. I told him how I was interested in brewing beer, and he said, "Well, come by the shop." And so went by the shop, bought all the equipment, put together my first kit, and started brewing. Within a month, I was kegging, and it had became this great hobby and kind of slowly became part of my lifestyle. O'Hooley's, shortly, about a year later, went under. A friend of mine, Art Ostrike, was interested in getting into the bar business in Athens, and I said, well, you should look into O'Hooley's because it's going out of business. We're not getting paychecks, and it's bad news over there. So he picked it up. He had some of my home brews. I had been extract brewing for a little over a year, maybe 30 batches, and I was offered the position to be the head brewer at the newly owned O'Hooley's, which soon became Jackie O's. So I did my first all-grain batch on the 7-barrel pub system at O'Hooley's in June, early June of 2006. So there was a former brewer from O'Hooley's. His name was Rat. He trained me for 2 months on a 7-barrel brew pub system. It was an old DME system from the 90s. It was in like the fermenters up front. There were 2 7-barrel fermenters up front, and their serial codes were in the high 200s. Years later, when we tried to get replacement parts for them from DME, they got back to us and said, we have no records of those tanks at that point in time. Everything was on paper, and those files are gone. So anyways, it was an early system, kind of archaic. There was 1920s UK dairy tanks in the basement, these Grundys that had these weird retrofitted tops on them. It was rough. But that's where I learned how to brew.
Right.
About a year after being on my own at O'Hooley's, getting about 60 batches under my belt, I then went to Siebel Brewing Institute in 2007 and did their 6-week associate's degree in brewing theory. And that really changed a lot of things. I really understood ingredients much better. I didn't understand them, but I understand them a little bit better, and process and engineering and
most folks go to Siebel before they start the brewery, not after. But hey,
not me.
Chart your own path.
But once I got back from Siebel, I had more confidence, and that's when I started creating imperial stouts, imperial IPAs. They weren't called double IPAs back then. Started playing around with higher alcohol beers, things that were a little bit more challenging and required. At the time, what I thought was more skill, but everything requires more skill. But then once I had this imperial stout recipe, I was like, well, I really want to start barrel aging. And this was towards the end of 2007. And I went back to Chicago. I met up with Pete Crowley, who was the brewer at the Rock Bottom in Chicago, and Will Turner, who was the pub brewer for Goose Island on Clybourne. They were packaging their barrel-aged beers for the World Beer Cup that year. And they were kind enough to allow me to come down to the basement while they were packaging those, and they gave me tips on how to get barrels, what equipment I needed, let me taste some things, and I bought 4 Woodford reserve barrels and started this barrel aging story that I'm getting ready to write a whole new chapter on now, almost 13 years later.
Those were 2007 is pretty early days, in that world. Not the earliest of days, but still very, very early on in this whole trend of brewing.
Yeah. It was Athens was an interesting spot. It was southeastern Ohio, about an hour away from Columbus. There was only one other brewery in southeastern Ohio at that time, and there was another brewer for 45 minutes from me. So I was kind of on my own. I was in this vacuum and was able to experiment. Thank you to the owner there and just kind of that environment that was fostering this new little brew pub. And so I got to try out a lot of new things, and that kind of helped carve this path of exploring and working with barrels and different ingredients, and kind of at the time what was considered extreme brewing. And as everybody evolved, the beer world just kept changing, but we were changing pretty quick in those earlier 2000s.
Sure. So, and we can talk more about what you've learned through that process of making barrel-aged beers. at Jackie O's. But what spurred this idea now to to walk? Because over your tenure at Jackie O's, I mean, Jackie O's has grown into a very large production brewery, producing a lot of beer, packaging a lot of beer, and putting a lot of beer out there into the market. It's a pretty bold move to walk away from director of operations for a large concern like that and start a very small, bespoke, very, very niche thing, of your own.
Yeah. Growing something from, in 2006, it was like 180 barrels of production to when I was left, it was close to 14,000. And to grow through that, you see a lot of things change. You learn a lot. Your whole perspective on creating beers and volume and how it sells and the marketing becomes more and more important than sometimes the actual creation of the beer does. And I did enjoy that. I found it very challenging, and it was this new area of brewing to explore and to try to champion. So at the end of the day, I had a moment when I was at the brew pub and I was helping out with some of the brewing there, and I hadn't brewed there in years, and it just struck me how awesome that little brewery system was, and the fact that like one batch of beer was being made that day, just one batch of beer, and all of your attention could be on this one batch that was moving through this process. And to go from starting there, falling in love with that system, then wanting more and thinking that system was small and archaic and shitty, and then building a big brewery with all these bells and whistles and centrifuges and all this stuff and 120 barrel tanks, and then to go back to that and say, this is awesome, this is where it's at. I knew then that at some point I needed to go back to small. I needed to go back to something that was more hands-on and more about the beer. So
it's funny, you're not the only one that I hear that same story from. I remember talking to John Meyer, the now retired brewmaster for Rogue, a few years ago, and when he brought in some little 5-barrel SS, pilot systems into the brewery, he would recount it with just this feeling of joy. He's like, I just love being back on the brew deck again. As other folks have said here on the podcast, as you move through your career, it all ends up in management. As you take on more and more responsibility.
Yeah.
And
your time on the platform,
right.
You're less valuable on the platform than you are out there in the field or, up there in the offices. And
And so you're telling a marketing story, or you are managing people, and it's not quite the same as making the thing, and it feels, connected to get back to that. So why then launch Private Press, move to California, and start this membership-only beer brand?
Yeah, so the move to California was really easy. My fiance, Dare Paterno, co-founder of Sante Darius, lives in Santa Cruz. We had been long distance for a number of years, and it was just a matter of time before we were going to close that gap, and California was going to be where that was going to happen, not Ohio. And
can't imagine why you wouldn't want to live in Ohio instead of Santa Cruz.
Santa Cruz is a beautiful place. I lived in Ohio my entire life.
Ohio is beautiful too.
But it is great to get out and see something different, and I couldn't be happier to be doing California with Adair and starting this new thing. But I knew that I had a chance that I could do something on my own, and I had been thinking about that for a long time. What is that? What does it look like? What beers am I going to produce? All those different things. And I kept going back to, what do I love? What beers do I love to make? What do I feel the most connection to? And that was without a doubt spirit barrel-aged, malt-forward, high-gravity beers, primarily imperial stouts and barley wines. And out of all the breweries in California, which there's a lot of them, not a lot of people are making those beers or really focusing on them, or they're kind of like a side story to the other beers that they're making. And so I knew that there was a little bit of a niche there that I could help fill.
Or they're doing on a humongous scale, like the brewery.
Yes, exactly.
Placentia,
Right. But, like coming from like the Midwest and Ohio and Michigan and Indiana, there's like all the breweries had these
the winters are
barrel
cold.
programs.
You need some barrel aged beers.
And then the question was, well, how do I make just these styles of beer. How do I make small amounts of them? And how can I do this and run the brewery without it running me? And that's when I started thinking more towards just a total membership club-based brewing model that only makes those types of beers, that allows pickups and ships direct to customer in the state of California. And I can treat it almost more like a winery than a brewery.
Yeah.
I can have a brewing season, packaging seasons, or a little bit of packaging each season, quarterly releases, and it's to active membership base. And it really seemed to make sense to me, because at Jackie O's, on that larger distribution panel, I knew how hard it was becoming to sell beer and to sell volume, and how saturated all the markets have become, and shelf space isn't getting any bigger. Giant tap rooms or restaurants with 40 taps, that doesn't make a lot of sense anymore. And there's tap rooms everywhere. And so competition is real. And because of that, the quality of everything has gotten incredibly high. And there's a ton of good beer being made. There's still bad beer. There always will be, and there always will be good beer. But I think anybody that really wants to succeed in the brewing world today is really trying, which means that the level is just getting so high. And even if you make an incredible beer and has a great name and good branding, it doesn't mean it's going to sell well. And that's just this reality right now.
Sure.
So I thought, if I don't have to compete with all that, I don't have a tasting room. I have this kind of captive membership audience that is interested in what I'm doing, that believes in what I'm doing, and I'm giving this exclusive product to them. Maybe I've got a chance to exist here without stepping on really anybody else's toes, and I can control it on many different levels. So that seemed really attractive to me.
Sure.
So I've been diving into that as deep and as far as I can.
Yeah. Let's talk about how you're going to produce beer, and then I want to get into more details about the how and whys of the barrel-aged beers that you make and why you make them that way. But before we do that, the founders launched SS Brewtech with a very clear goal to advance brewing equipment design, performance, and quality to the very highest standards in the industry. With a team that draws upon strong functional backgrounds in brewing science, mechanical engineering, industrial design, supply chain, and manufacturing, SS Brewtech has the people and skill sets you want and expect from your supplier of pro brewing equipment. Head over to ssbrewtech.com for more information on their brew houses and brewing gear. Also, we now have a special message from Pabst Brewing Company.
Out of the west, a storm surprised. Swept down on Captain Pabst. That mariner and gentleman, his action swift and fast. He sailed the seabird against the throes, routing twain wind and fear. He took haste to protect his kin, but the port was far from near. Pabst's intuition proved him right, and bore a friendly coast. The mighty seabird crashed aground, and to that we raise a toast. For while the seabird indeed was lost, safe were kin and crew, and without this mighty ship to steer, Captain Pabst began to brew. Captain Pabst Seabird IPA, exclusively available in Wisconsin and Chicago.
So let's talk about making beer, because that's what we love to talk about most here on the podcast. You're building an entire brewery just to brew these beers, and you brewed quite a few at Jackie O's and designed a whole bunch over the years.
Yep.
The Oil of Aphrodites and the Dark Apparitions and the Brick Kiln barley wines and the Champion Grounds barrel-aged coffee. So
it just goes on and on.
On and on and
so
on and
many,
on.
yeah.
And I'm pulling them all out of my head because I'm very familiar with these beers and have drunk quite a few of them over the years. Let's talk a little bit about how over the last 5 or 8 years you've watched barrel-aged beers change.
Yeah.
that's something that I see from our perspective. Looking back even 6 years ago, the very first issues of our magazine, first tackling barrel-aged beers to looking at what we're drinking now. When you look at it from that kind of perspective, it's rather remarkable how much different the beers are today
completely.
in such a short amount of time. Talk to me from your perspective in terms of grist and grain, in terms of technical process. How have your recipes developed, over the last 5 or 6 years?
The main thing that I think has really changed for the beer style of like imperial stout and even barley wine is just mainly residual sugar that is left in that beer. When I was originally,
like Henry says, you got to give the kids their Play-Dohs.
Yep. That's a good one. I'll stick to that one. Like when I was first brewing like Dark Ap and Oil of Aphrodite, those beers were starting at 25 Play-Doh and finishing at 5 Play-Doh.
5, that's so retro.
I know. It's so watery and thin, and you can barely taste it. So they were that, and that was working for a long time, and then you just had to start cranking it up, and then to create things that were finishing at 7 or 8 Play-Doh seemed really foreign at the time, and now that number is 10,
Still
11, 15. So it's just like this idea of body, sweetness, thickness is, thick is a word that gets thrown around a lot. And, so as you're kind of creating new beers or updating old beers so that they're still relevant and that they still resonate with the greater consumer, it's like, how do you do that? Do you add more malt? Do you mash higher? Do you add more sugar? Do you add more lactose? Do you use maltodextrin? Do you double mash? All of a sudden, there's all these different ways to do it. And that's what I've loved about beer, though, is like there's so many different ways to brew everything. And it's how do you approach it? What kind of equipment do you have? What do you feel comfortable with?
So what was your approach, and what kind of pace did you take to this? I mean, that's, it's something that every commercial brewer should or tends to know, that, recipes often, even if you're Anheuser-Busch, your recipes change over time.
Yeah.
They are focus grouping recipes, and recipe changes. And what matters most to them is how people perceive that brand. When you have a brand like Dark Apparition at Jackie O's, consumers have a certain expectation for it. And, yet at the same time, you're constantly looking to make a better version of that. And so,
Absolutely.
So kind of iterating and improving, because everyone knows they can always improve. Everyone can always improve everything. You always want to be improving, but you don't want to improve in a way that's super obvious to a drinker. You want it to be a natural progression where they don't realize why they like it a little bit more this time than they did last time. Talk to me about, for you, what those parameters look like, and kind of moving and shifting these things to keep up with what consumers expect for it now.
Yeah, so it was like, identifying what needed to be increased. So let's say it's finishing gravity, residual sugar left, and finished beer. So first step was, let's really max out the mash time.
Yeah.
Not with like caramel malt, but with 2-row. Let's get more base malt in there. Let's get this stuff converting a little bit more. Let's lower the mash temperature. Let's get down to 149, 148. Let's try to just pull more sugar out, because at some point the yeast is going to crap out, and that's what's going to be left. It's not that by lowering the mash temp, you might be creating more fermentable sugar, but at some point that yeast is going to stop, and that sugar is still going to be there. And so we started there and, gained maybe a point or 2 Play-Doh on that finishing gravity, but knew that we needed a little bit more. And then it became, let's add more sugar. Let's maybe add 30 minutes to the boil. And through all these parameters and just, brewing Dark Ap, maybe doing a 20 or 40 barrel batch every other week or so, we were able, within the course of a couple months, to kind of dial that in, get that up, and feel comfortable about the price of goods and or the cost of all the materials going in, and also the time, how it worked with the brew house, the brew schedule, how it was working in tanks, yeast, so on. Now that I'm able to have this fresh start with private press, it's able to take like all those experiences and focus them into this new thing, have these new parameters. This is, I want to hit 32, 33, 34 Plato starting gravity, and I want that to be finishing somewhere between 14 and 12, ideally.
Yeah.
It doesn't always work that way, especially when you don't have your own brew house and you're playing around on someone else's brew house or multiple different brew houses.
Right.
So, that target keeps moving, but it's been really fun to just continue to press on with these things, less sparging water.
Right.
Longer boils, keep it going, and more sugar or different sugar sources. I'm playing around with a lot of different recipes right now, so each one's a little different, but you start to find that pocket, and then you just try to focus and send it through that area.
Are you considering and brewing these beers as single things, or are you building kind of a library of stock to pull from?
Yes, my intention with private press is that all the releases will be a blended expression. So brewing multiple different imperial stouts, multiple barley wines, and putting each of those batches into different types of bourbon and or spirit barrels, so that within one batch of 16 barrels I might have 4 different threads or 2 different threads. Maybe it's a wheated bourbon barrel or a rye bourbon barrel, so that when it comes time to assemble these beers or these releases, I can really select the most expressive threads, so I can get that roundest expression of whatever I'm searching for, be it an adjunct heavy stout possibly, or something that really kind of expresses the wood character, or something that's maybe a little spirit forward. So everything's going to be blended. So I'm just building out this library.
So one of the things that I always find interesting is how you build these components, and how you think about the parameters of these various components, because it is, and I hear it fairly often. I love to brew a bunch of beers, and even Corey will say that, I brew all these different base beers, and then I want to blend for specific things. But what you end up with in your blend is a direct result of how you think about some of these things that you're putting into those barrels, these various threads. You are creating the pigments that you'll then paint with later on, but there has to be some thought that goes into how you create these component things now. Talk to me a little bit about some of the ways that you build these characterfully different expressions of barrel-aged beers that you can then blend later on.
So I don't try to overthink too many things. I try to keep it fairly simple. So doing something like an imperial stout that has a high percentage of wheat in it, that's its own thread. Doing one that has a half of the base malt is Munich, that would be a different thread. Then you can get into different types of sugars that are added, be it honey or maple or brown sugar or liquid malt extract or dry malt extract. You're going to get light or dark or medium. You can get all these different hues, if you will, or variations upon imperial stout, and I try to keep it kind of really focused upon that. Everything's got a little bit of oats in it. Everything's got some Munich.
Sure.
This might have Special B, but that one might have Wireman 125 or Special W. Very similar, but a light difference. What for me it really changes is what barrels those go into.
Okay.
So as I'm ordering barrels and knowing what beer is going into those, trying to select 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 different things that can build off of, and then knowing that they're going to age for 10, 14, 24 months.
Right.
And understanding how to listen and work with the barrels as you're tasting them, as they're reaching their mature age, and really focusing on what that barrel is telling you, and in the back of your head thinking about what the beer is that you're assembling. So for me, when I was tasting barrels, and I developed this kind of idea or this process over thousands of barrels that I've tasted at Jackie O's over the last 12, 13 years, where do I feel it? That's the first thing I always focus on. If it's in my throat, if I feel an alcohol burn in my throat, that's uncomfortable. That barrel's not ready, needs more time. If I start to feel the warmth, it's getting closer. If it's on my collarbone, or most importantly within my chest, that's warm and that's comforting. And that made me know that this beer is in a really good spot right now. I have some time that it can sit here and continue to age, but this is ready. This is presenting itself in a very warm capacity, and that's what I want in my beers. And then the other part of it was we're making really intense beer styles, putting them into really intense vessels, being these spirit barrels, and they need to age, mainly because they're really intense, and we need that micro-oxygenation, that age to dull the beer, to stale it down, to make it so it's palatable and smooth, and so the age and the warmth and listening to that beer and that barrel and then finding its spot is what I'm really focused on. And
oxygenation, that's I think a good point to make, because that is this process that that transforms these beers. It is micro oxygenation, as well as picking up of wood character, vanillins and and tannins from that barrel. So how do you design ingredients for these these beers in order to pull the best aspects of oxidation out of them and not the worst aspects?
Always having a decent amount of dark malts. Always, that benefits these beers. That's why imperial stouts are always just this like paramount, beer style for barrel aging. So always making sure that there's some black malt in there for sure. Maybe roasted barley, maybe not. Definitely a heavy amount of chocolate malt.
Yeah.
When
you say heavy, what does that mean?
Percentage wise, I don't know, maybe close to 8 to 10%. Like maybe throw an extra bag in. If you think that there's enough, maybe just toss an extra bag in.
Okay.
On a 20 barrel system, let's say. Let's just, if you got 150, just make it 200. And then just using those really deep caramel malts, those burnt ones, These are these kind of deeper, really rough, robust characters that will slowly fade and mellow out with that oxidation, and they're still going to compete with that barrel character, and all those intensities will just slowly come together. But it takes time, and you got to give it time, and you also need to pay attention to how the beer is changing. Doesn't mean you got to taste it every day or even every week, but you got to take notes. You got to be present, and a barrel program needs attention, just like any other program. But sometimes it's the last thing on the list, and what makes me so excited about private press is it's the only thing on the list.
Sure.
I'm not worried about IPAs, cans, distribution, any of that. It's how do I make the best beer that I can make.
What did that tasting process look like at Jackie O's? You mentioned you had 1,000 barrels. I mean, this is a major undertaking to taste those, considering how quickly these kinds of beers also shred the palate of anybody that's tasting them. You try to move through 20 or 30 barrels in a day, great, you might be able to reasonably taste that many, But okay, you've 30 barrels in. Well, you've got
Yeah.
970 more. Good luck tasting through those. That's a enormous undertaking to kind of stay on top of it. What are your broader parameters for figuring out when and how to get the most value out of that kind of tasting and sampling process?
The biggest thing for me was doing it as often as I could.
Okay.
It was just practice. Anything that you want to get good at, develop instinct. Just like kind of have this developed style or palate. You just got to do it a lot. It doesn't mean
10,000 hours, right?
Exactly.
That's the path to mastery.
Yep. So, and it's also important that okay, I don't taste more than 30 barrels. Sometimes I would get in crunches with bourbon barrel dark aberration where there was 80 barrels or I had to taste through 100 of them, and I'd break them up into 3 days or something. And those were pretty difficult.
Sure.
You take notes, and they start off really specific, and then you get down to the bottom, and it's bomb with an exclamation mark, and you're like, all right, tasting done. But you just have to you have to do it a lot, right? And you got to take notes, and you got to be able to go back and do it again. And so at Jack Yo's, luckily I didn't have to taste everything all at once.
Sure.
Each beer was in this stall, and so I would taste the second level of barrels as it was aging. So they'd come from the brewery, stack up, and I wouldn't move them until it was time for them to be released. And I taste that second level starting around 4 months or so. And I taste them periodically just to kind of monitor where that heat was. Is it uncomfortable or is it comforting? That neck to collarbone to chest character. And then once I knew that was going to be ready, which was always around a year, then downstack everything. Lab would come in, pull samples of every single barrel to run micro on. They would also pull a 50 milliliter sample for me. Then I'd come in, and then I'd take notes on the 50 milliliter samples. I'd pull 25, smell, taste, swallow, notes. If it was bad, I'd dump it. If it was good, that extra 25 milliliters in that 50 milliliter tube would then go into a glass. This would give me an idea of what all the good barrels tasted like together, all of them. And then I'd taste that, take notes. Then I'd wait a couple weeks, lab results come back, eliminate all bad barrels. Taste again, all the good barrels, figure that out. And then if there were excellent barrels, maybe hold them back. Maybe the blend needs the extra excellent barrels. If there were not so good barrels, maybe kick them out, or maybe blend them in because we needed that volume for distribution. So there was a lot of angles that went into it.
Sure.
And then there were just plenty of days where I'd just go in and just taste barrels, just to taste barrels, check in on things.
Right.
Oh, this is 6 months old. I haven't drilled into it yet. Let's drill. Taste 4 of them, get an idea.
What does your language, what do your descriptors matter to you? This is also a fascinating subject for me because, when we taste things, we have subconscious or reactions to these things that don't have words to them. And yet, various brewers also develop their own language for understanding, what these flavors are in their beers. Lauren Limbach in New Belgium has a very clear language that she's developed for herself. Do you have that kind of language, and how do you describe some of these various elements of the beer from a sensorial perspective?
So typically it was always around the first 6 to 8 barrels I would taste or do sensory on. I would explain as much as I could. I'm not writing a paragraph. It's one line, but it's distinctive. Aroma, flavor, mouthfeel.
Yeah.
If anything is off or seems fruity, I would have a color coding thing. I'd have a
seems fruity. That's a mark against in your book. Okay.
Yeah. It would have.
Is that because of the potential spoiler? Or
yes, exactly. Not fruity like raisin or stone fruit, but fruity like cherries or raspberries. Right. So then I'd put a red question mark next to the fruity ones. Or if they were just terrible, it was just bad, and then red through it. So then I could go with spray paint to that barrel and X it out. Okay,
Yeah,
so there's
yeah.
no, like, that's
Right.
not making it back to the brewery. But after those 6 to 8 barrels, I would then identify what the pocket was. So there is these characters that keep coming up, and now I know what my pocket is. That's where I want this beer to land within that. And then what I focus on is barrels that fall outside of the pocket, whether it be in a positive sense or in
Yeah.
a negative sense.
Sure.
And that's what I would focus on more. And I could simply write in the pocket. And because, I mean, at some point, you just start repeating yourself. And so I'd rather do that with one word
Right.
than with 10, you know? And at some point, you got to go home, you know?
Sure. Sure.
So it was all about, you know, finding that pocket and then identifying the barrels that were exceptional and
Yeah.
the ones that were dismal.
And what does an exceptional barrel taste like? You know, how do you? Obviously, these are all relative, and I know these are hard, questions to try to answer.
To me, it wasn't. I mean, it depended on the base beer, of course, and what
Sure.
and what it was, but it's more of a feeling than anything. It makes you, it smacks you. You like, wow, or like it evokes an emotion.
Yeah.
It that says like, hey, I'm here. I'm not just one of these barrels in a pocket. I'm here. And like I keep saying, it happens on both ends of the spectrum, right? So you have to like be present when you're tasting. Like if you can be in a quiet area, if you can maybe have somebody else with you, or I did most of it by myself. But you want this area where you're focused on that, and that's what you're doing, and you're actively doing it. I can't stress that enough, because you'll just miss it. It will just be another pocket barrel, and it will just go in, and or it can be set aside and make something really special that makes your customers, and it's part of the story too. I mean, there's more to it than just the beer taste exceptional. It's like
Sure.
like these hand-selected things, these reserve things. That's what gives the blender or the brewer or even the brewery it's credit. Like it's like they really know what they're doing. These happy accidents don't happen anymore. There's intent, there's vision, there's palate, there is this drive behind it. It's not just an afterthought. It's not a couple barrels in the corner. This is identity.
You're a brewer and a curator in that sense, and that you're creating the thing, and then you're selecting from your things, and you're building something from these things that you select. And that kind of curatorial act is as important to the art of creation as the brewing is to
Absolutely.
it. And and so overlooking or treating that one, with a callousness or a quickness rather than this kind of studied intentionality would seem to be as bad of an idea as saying, let's just throw some barley in the, and it'll probably work out okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's extremely expensive beer, like
Right.
the beer itself is expensive. The time and the rent that's going into it is way more than anything else. The barrels are expensive, the racks. I mean, it just goes on and on. So why would you just push it through?
Right.
But it's easier said than done.
Sure.
Depends on what's happening at the brewery. I can't tell you how many times that it was just like at the end of a 10-hour day, I was like, and now I got to go to the barrel room and taste 36 barrels because we're packaging it next week, or I've got to be at a beer festival next week, and that's when they need to package it. So I got to move through all these barrels, and I'm exhausted. And the blend might have turned out okay, but it could have been better, guaranteed.
Yeah.
And I couldn't be more happy to just be sinking all of my efforts into these 10 little releases and creations that I'm going to put forth in the first kind of annual cycle of Private Press, and to be able to brew twice as many barrels as I'm actually going to need, so that I can, of course, take into account loss and
Sure.
and spoilers, but also be able to select the most expressive threads that are ready at that moment and put them together and hopefully create something special and unique and something that speaks of myself and of the brewing effort of Private Press.
And then add a bunch of vanilla to it and a whole bunch of other adjuncts.
At
That's what the
least a
kids
pound
want.
per barrel. Yeah. I gotta start taste testing marshmallows here soon. But
Let's. I joke, but
Me too.
at the same time, that kind of ingredient approach to stouts and even now barley wines, strangely enough, has become more and more standard. In this kind of sphere. Talk to me a little bit about how you think about designing these kinds of big beers and working on ingredient processes for some of the more popular ingredients now added to imperial stouts.
It's a great question, Jamie. So what I'm hoping I'm able to do with Private Press is, now that there's the whole pastry stout movement, and those are all over the place now, and they're getting a lot of excitement. I'm hoping that there's an undercurrent of beer consumer that is now going back to, not really old school, but something that's a little bit more pure, something that's a little bit more of the barrel, of the base beer. For me and many of my other peers to think back to like when you first had like Bourbon County vanilla rye, like that moment, or even the Bourbon County coffee stout, or like these hints of things and this nuance, still bold and big, but not over the top. Of course, the sugar content's going to be higher now, but I'm really just I want to have some tact to it. I want to have I don't want it to be over the top, but I want it to be loud, but just kind of teetering on that edge.
This is it's a constant struggle that brewers have, of making the products that their consumers want to buy, which are these loud and sweet things, and then also wanting to make a nuanced or even a historically looking or tradition looking including more smoked malt or dark stuff that may not necessarily be within what is currently considered cool, or which may elicit potentially negative responses from a certain number of beer nerd traders out there. Not to speak ill, they're customers and spending money, but meeting this consumer expectation can be a challenge based, given that. But at the same time, tastes are also constantly changing and evolving, and as soon as we think that consumers are only thinking about the beers in this one way, they start to surprise everyone. Obviously, look at the legitimate rise of lagers now. Beer writers have been predicting, the rise of lagers for the last 10 or 15 years, and it never happened. And it is actually legitimately
happening
right
is great.
now. And brewers are selling more lager and seeing more demand for those lagers from their consumers. And they're not just like, a bunch of 65-year-old men consumers that have just found them and want lagers. They're the same guys that are buying pastry stouts that are, putting a sidecar of Pilsner next to it. And it's kind of cool to see that these, the Venn diagrams of these overlapping consumers are, they're more intermixed than we might want to. It'd be too easy to put them into very oversimplified buckets, but they don't actually live in those buckets.
Yeah. So I guess what I'm excited about and trying to do is just, this is my expression and of these beers, a blend of new and old. Kind of this culmination of my experience over the past decade plus, and giving it room where it can also continue to evolve, and building that library of all these different beers, different starting gravities, finishing gravities, the ability to read from a barrel. There's a lot of vanilla character in this. That should be paired with Ugandan, or this should be paired with a different type of vanilla, or just this should go in the vanilla bourbon barrel aged imperial stout thing I'm going to put out.
Right.
You know, and I'm, you know, hopefully there's people out there that find that attractive or appealing and are interested in that. And meanwhile, there's so many breweries out there that are producing all this different beer, and you know, it's all subjective. You know, they're all different listeners, different drinkers, and hopefully there's this small 500 member audience out there that is interested in my, you know,
Sure.
my new release.
Right,
And
right.
you know, I'm just I'm watching what's going on. I'm loving getting back into the brew house every once in a while, and it feels great to just be sweating and getting sugar all over my Carhartts, and you know, ripping open a box cutter all the time, and because it's been a long time since I've done that,
Sure.
and it feels great and it feels right. And right now I'm just kind of slowly building this stock up, and soon enough I'm going to let some things loose, and
then it's game on.
can't wait. Yeah, game on.
Let's talk a little bit about barley wine. We talk a lot about imperial stouts because obviously it's a big style and it's something a lot of people make, but we don't talk a lot about brewing barley wines. When it comes to but you brew a lot of them, and you know, probably Jackie O's sells quite a few of those.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but can be a hard style for other breweries to sell. You know, but you all at Jackie O's staked out a territory for it. What do you think, you know, were some of the differentiators in why those beers as barrel-aged barley wines were able to find an audience, and a lot of other barley wines have more challenge finding that kind of audience?
So first barley wine I brewed was in 2008 at Jackie O's, and it was not very good, and I just kept trying. Not often, you know, there would be a couple barley wine brews per year, like 2, maybe 3. But over the course of 3, almost 4 years is when I finally kind of like fell into this brick kiln thing. And a big part of falling into that brick kiln thing was drinking things like King Henry, Bly's barley wine, barrel-aged Arctic Wolf. There was East End, you know.
Gratitude.
Yes, Gratitudes. And I could go on and on. But it was drinking beers like that, trading for them while I was brewing at Jackie O's to like try to figure out, reverse engineer these things, right? And try to figure out what makes these so good, you know, and playing around with things like Maris Otter, playing around with American two-row, what types of caramel malts, how much Munich needs to be in there. Should there be some dark malt in there? If so, what is that? What's the volume on it? And playing around with these things and then putting them into barrels and seeing what happens. And it was 2012 or so, I think, when the first bourbon barrel brick kiln came out, and rum barrel brick kiln. And that's when I kind of settled in on that recipe. And then it was like slowly building off of that. I remember at one point we had 7 different barley wines aging in spirit barrels in our barrel warehouse. And that's when then it was like, well, let's start blending these. And there's Cellar Cuvée 11. And let's play with rye. Let's do 100% Maris Otter. Let's do maple syrup one, which was Iron Furnace. Let's do triple IPA. Just don't dry hop it. Throw it in the barrels. It was this like patriarch version. Bunch of different things. So then it was just like, well, I can play with all these different barley wine components. And now it's like, for me, it's a lot about base malt. Maris Otter's great. Two-row works very well as well. American yeast can make a very good, you know, toffee, caramel, English-style barley wine.
Yeah.
If you're going to barrel age it, sometimes a touch of chocolate malt really works with the barrel well. Throws the color a little darker, but that doesn't seem to matter too much to anybody.
Right.
And don't hop it too much. Use English varietals. You know, hit it, you know, around 35, 45 IBUs. Give it a little flavor. You don't really need to care about it, aroma, but yeah, get some of that dark caramel in there. I always throw Munich in, a little bit of oats. But yeah, and then throw in a little extra sugar, and that can be whatever you feel like. But
What do you like for extra sugar in there?
well, I mean, like I brewed this wheat wine at Jackie O's for a long time. Would Ya Honey, started brewing that in 2008. Honey worked really well in that beer. It was this beautiful kind of honeycomb raisin type character. Just released a beer here today at Side Project called Maple in the Wood. It's the first wheat wine that Side Project had done. We put a lot of maple into that beer and aged it in some maple bourbon barrels. And this is tasting awesome. And I couldn't be more happy to be putting out the first barrel-aged beer or collab from Private Press with my good friend Corey and the people at Side Project. But
Shameless plug.
I know. I had to do it. Some Mutton's dry malt extract works really well.
Okay.
The Breeze liquid malt extract, maybe the amber, or they also have a Munich. That one can be kind of nice. Brown sugar usually works pretty well as well. I mean, you just gotta play around. You gotta find what you like.
And this is a hot side process, right?
Yes.
Not a
hot side process.
Not a feeding a fermentation to push alcohol.
No, I never did too much of that.
Okay.
Played around a little bit with that with a wee heavy recipe, which I don't think has come out yet from Jackie O's. And it's been in barrel for at least 20 months. It's probably tasting really good. It was super almondy when I was leaving.
Yeah, sounds delicious.
But yeah, I never haven't done much of adding sugar during fermentation. Usually long boils and a healthy amount of sugar in the kettle, and then just making sure it gets a good yeast pitch and a lot of oxygen. I mean, I'm not like breaking any secrets here.
Sure.
But I think it's just important that you have a good idea of what you want, and you do the research, and that might mean brewing, versions of it that maybe don't quite get to where you want it, but you take notes, you do research, you put the time in, and you have this vision, this point that you want to hit, and you actively work towards it. And that's what's important to me.
So, if you don't mind, one of the big things that everybody learns from are the mistakes that you make in the process. Are there any, a couple of things that over the last couple of years of making barrel-aged beers that didn't work and that you learned from in the process of that?
Yeah, one of the biggest things I learned was that pasteurization is not a bad thing. It is not.
It sounds like there's an expensive story here.
There's an extremely expensive story. Unfortunately, there was a very large infection problem at Jackie O's, and throughout the history of Jackie O's, there was some issues, mainly because in the early years we were doing it out of the basement, out of a little single head filler that I wasn't really, I guess, cleaning that well, and it was in this tiny little basement with also mixed fermentation happening, and so we learned a lot about separation and had a couple pretty good years, and then we just had this really bad year where we called about 12 or 14 different brands, and it was hundreds of thousands of cases. It was very unfortunate, and it was one of the most difficult times of my brewing career, without a doubt. But we really tightened up on a lot of lab procedures. We got a inline pasteurization unit, and kind of just readjusted and just kept pressing forward. We got a new bottling line, got rid of the old one. There was a Lactobacillus acetotolerans bug, which is kind of like, it's notorious for the Bourbon County infection.
Right, 2015.
But that thing had embedded itself into our bottling line, and it was just hooking us up every time.
God,
and
it's the worst place too.
It was really difficult. It was during a period where Jackie O's had grown quite a bit. There was a big expansion that went on, and we tried to hit everything that we could as far as scaling up. but unfortunately that little bottling line stayed, and all of a sudden, there was millions of dollars of product going through a $60,000 machine, and it just caught up. It caught up to us all, but we didn't give up, and and invested in a lot of new QC stuff. One being that flash pasteurizer, and that helped out immensely. I will have a smaller bath pasteurizer at Private Press, but it's just really hard to make barrel-aged beer, and especially barrel-aged beer with adjuncts in it.
Right.
And
right.
to get it into a bottle, have it be shelf or cellar stable, and I don't know how some of us did it before we had all that stuff, when we were still learning. I can pop some really old bottles, and they're not infected. They don't taste that great because they're old, but I don't know how that one's not infected and this one is. But you learn from all these mistakes. That was one of the biggest ones for sure. And the other big one that I learned was if a beer doesn't taste good in the fermenter, don't put it into the barrel.
Yeah.
Because that might fix it. You don't make A grade beverage with F grade beverage. You can't.
Right.
You can't get there.
It's not a magic panacea that's going to make everything better.
No, avoid happy accidents. Okay, just avoid them, and don't even use that word. It's not good. Really try to think about what you're doing, and line it up, set it up for success, and do the research, put the time in, and then knock it out of the park, or try at least know what you want, and try to move towards that. It will weave and whatnot, and it might land a little bit outside of it, but at least try to get it to this one point, and don't just cross your fingers and hope, because it's taken up space somewhere that could be taken up by a project that has a good chance of succeeding.
Yeah.
And that's what it really comes down to. That's what us as brewers want, and that's what the consumer wants as well. And anything that falls outside of that or below that just doesn't feel very good.
I like to think about it in these terms, that the further and further we get into this, the more discreet and in-depth consumers' abilities and all of our abilities are to parse small differences between these things. Like what you said earlier is true. We get better and better at brewing this stuff, and there are a lot of great brewers out here in the world now, in the world of craft beer. And there's never been a better time for people who enjoy great, well-made craft beer. There is more being made of it now than there ever has been in the history of beer. But what comes along with that, is in every kind of industry where these things continue to develop, the other thing that develops is the customer's ability to parse even smaller and smaller and smaller differences between these things. That no matter where you never get to a point where there isn't some difference between average, good, and great. There will always be that difference between average, good, and great. The difference between those things may get narrower, but at the same time, the customer's ability to discern those differences also improves at the same exact time. And so what you're saying, I think, rings true, and that having that intentionality about how you create these things, and just thinking that people won't notice, or this might be good enough, or we might just get lucky, that's more of a losing strategy as consumers' tastes also develop in this.
And as thinking of a brewer that takes it very passionately, you're like an artist, and you want these things to resonate. You want good feedback, and it's not always going to happen, but man, if you can reduce the amount of negative feedback that you get, especially on social media or Untapped or however tied in you are to those things, that stuff doesn't help anything. I mean, it can get pretty toxic, and going through that infection period at Jackie O's, I mean, that was really hard, and I wouldn't wish that on anybody. So,
Right.
Just like I can't stress it enough. Like, know or have a good idea of what you want to do, and really think about how you're gonna get it to the point that you want. If you want it to just be on draft, great. Then work towards that. If you want to put it into a bottle, you got some other things that you have to consider. You got to really think about how are you going to do that? Is it going to be stable?
Right.
Lab testing, all this different stuff. Maybe pasteurization. But
We talked to Doug Dozark from Cycle at length about pasteurization.
Yeah, me too.
Doug's
one of my very, very dear friends, and we have all. I mean, I know. I've formed all these opinions and these approaches from being close friends with people like Doug and Corey and a lot of people here at the festival, and and a long relationship with Sean Hill and a ton of people. I feel so blessed to have these amazing friends in this industry, and we've all shared a lot of information, and we've all commiserated with ourselves over our failures and our shortcomings, and we all are still here making beer, and we're still some sort of a driving force in this craft beer canon that exists here in the U.S., and we're just trying to stick around and be relevant, right? And so you just got to step it up.
So what's the goal, and what's the definition of success for you and for Private Press? When will you know that you've made it?
I'd like to say when 500 members sign up for the first kind of annual membership cycle. That's my main goal right now. If I can deliver some amazing beer to them that make them feel like them signing up was worth it, and that's success to me. I'm going to try my hardest to make the best beer that I can, and I hope that's good enough. And it's just kind of like, I don't know, it's pretty straightforward and honest. This is the beer that I love to make, and I want to make the loveliest expression of it that I can.
Well, there's nowhere to hide, and there's no one else to blame.
Nope,
if there's
just me.
You.
Yep.
And that's it.
Once again, I'm answering all the emails, and yeah, I just hope that it's more positive than it's negative.
Sure. Well, I think that brings us to a close. Before we get out of here, G&D Chillers is ready to meet your challenge. Kickstart your innovation with Old Orchard Craft Juice Concentrates. SS Brewtech has the knowledge and experience you need, and Captain Pabst Seabird IPA is now available exclusively in Wisconsin and Chicago. Brad, if people want to learn more about Private Press, where do they find you?
Go to privatepressbrewing.com, sign up for the mailing list, or check us out at Private Press Brewing on Instagram and Facebook.
If you've enjoyed the conversation, go to beerandbrewing.com, click on that subscribe button, and become a subscriber, supporter, and a member of our family. We greatly appreciate it, and it helps us keep doing what we do. Brian Clark, thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Cheers.
Cheers.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com, or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.